Good afternoon, everyone. We are, excuse me, we're so pleased to have you join us as we virtually welcome Ambassador of the European Union to the United States, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis. My name is Aaron Mann, and I serve as the moderator for today's program. I'm a current board member of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we are so glad to have you all with us here today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan, educational, nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. Whether you are joining us live today or viewing this recording later, we invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events and how you can join the IRC as a member. All this can be found on our website at irckc.org. Now, in 1992, Ambassador Andreas Van Agt, head of delegation for the Commission of European Communities to the US, visited Kansas City and spoke to members of the International Relations Council about Europe's future in a changing world. Nearly 30 years later, Europe and the world at large look considerably different, while many of the same issues of shared concern, both the EU and the US, remain in focus. So we hope you will engage with us today as we hear from Ambassador Lambrinidis. And before we get started, I'd like to give a little bit of background for the ambassador. Stavros Lambrinidis is the ambassador of the European Union to the United States, and he's been in that role since March 1st of 2019. From 2012 to 2019, he served as the European Union Special Representative for Human Rights. In 2011, he was the Foreign Affairs Minister of Greece. Between 2004 and 2011, he was twice elected as a member of the European Parliament with the Greek Social Democratic Party. He served as Vice President of the European Parliament, Vice President of the Civil Liberties, Justice, and Home Affairs Committee, and the head of the delegation for the Greek Social Democratic Party. Between 2000 and 2004, he was the Director General of the International Olympic Truce Centre, an International Olympic Committee organization. He served as ambassador ad personam of the Hellenic Republic from 1999 to 2004, and as Secretary General of the Greek Foreign Ministry responsible for Diaspora Greeks. Between 1998 and 1993, he was an attorney at Wilmer, Cutler Pickering in Washington, D.C., specializing in international trade, transactions, and arbitration. He's received numerous recognitions for his work on human rights and privacy, including the Electronic Privacy Information Center's Champion of Freedom Award in 2020, and the Boston Global Forum's World Leader in Artificial Intelligence Award this past year. He's a member of the President's Council on International Activities at Yale University and a former president of the DC Bar Association's Human Rights Committee. Ambassador Lambrinidis was born in Athens, Greece in 1962. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree in Economics and Political Science from Amherst College and his JD from Yale Law School, where he was also the managing editor of the Yale Journal of International Law. He is married and has a daughter, and we are so very pleased to have him here with us today. Ambassador Lambrinidis, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate your time. Please, the floor is yours.
Aaron, thank you so much for this kind introduction. It's great to be with you at the IRC. Has it really been 30 years since the last EU ambassador spoke to you? That's not okay.
Well, nevertheless, we're making up for lost time, and we appreciate that you're here today.
That's certainly true. So, Aaron, I think I'm going to use the opportunity to kick off this discussion by telling you a few things about the European Union itself, and then our priorities when it comes to our work with the US. And I hope that that's going to be helpful to frame also your questions and any questions, comments from the friends who are with us today. Now, indeed, this is not your grandfather's EU, and it's not your grandfather's United States either, or your grandmother's for that matter. We have changed a lot in the past 30 years. The European Union is fundamentally a project of peace and reconciliation following the Second World War. We started organizing as European countries back in the 50s in different iterations. Now we are the EU of 27 independent countries united in the European Union context in a way that very much resembles, if you like, the US system. Many times people think that the EU is something out there, strange, difficult to understand. But in the end of the day, we're not a federated state like the US is. But we have 27, as opposed to 50 states here, 27 independent countries who decided to pool their sovereignty in the European Union on a number of topics, to keep sovereignty on other topics, and to share sovereignty with the EU on yet another group of topics. In many ways, this does reflect the federalism system that you have in the US, with states retaining powers and rights on some topics, but also having agreed at your constitution to transfer others to the federal government. We function entirely democratically in that context. We have a process that ensures that the will of the people through the European Parliament that is freely elected in all 27 member states, the will of our member states through what we call the European Council, which is where the member states meet, and the collective interests of the European Union itself through the European Commission, which is in a sense our federal government back in Brussels, are reflected in our decisions. Decisions in which the European Parliament has for the past few years a decisive role and voice on in the vast majority of them. Fundamentally, what we also are, and people in this country know us perhaps more for this, is a single market. This is the seminal achievement of the EU in the past decades. Sometimes I hear people, accusing us of being bureaucrats, a bureaucratic institution. It's quite interesting, frankly, because everyone working for the European Commission is a bureaucrat, but everyone working for the US government is a civil servant. Now, I don't know how this works, but in fact, it's everything but. If you look at the single market, what we did is we actually took the bureaucratic different laws, regulations of 27, 28 at the time, independent countries, and we got rid of them, and we replaced them with one single set of rules and regulations that required our member states to make very serious adjustments to be able to have the structures and the laws in the countries to reflect that single set of rules. But we don't have 27, 28 different rules now. We have one. And that has allowed us to knock down the borders in what is the biggest and the most open market in the world today, the European Union, of 450 million of the most wealthy consumers. And that has allowed us to grow economically in an exponential rate in the past years. We've also established a common currency, the euro, which most of our member states have adopted. And that has made our economy and our economic stability and our presence in the world huge and decisive. Now, I'll say a little bit more about trade later. Now, we have also expanded our authority jointly as EU when it comes to foreign policy. We set up our own foreign ministry. We call it the European External Action Service back in 2010. We have more than 140 embassies around the world. The one that I am the ambassador to, the European Union Embassy in Washington, D.C. to the United States, is one of those 140 embassies. And fundamentally, when it comes to this country, the United States, the historical and the values link that tie us are unbreakable. It started in many ways in recent history, at least with the Marshall Plan. which we attribute a tremendous value to when it came to our own creation as Europeans and European Union. And it has continued over the decades, working together on shared values, common interests with the United States. And this is something that we are committed to do with any administration that is in the White House, no matter what political party it comes from. I came here, as you mentioned, Aaron, in 2019 under the Trump administration. It was a more difficult time than for transatlantic relations. There was a belief that the EU was, in some ways, the rhetoric even went as far as to say it was an enemy of the United States and of U.S. interests. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. But at that time, I had to work a lot to actually explain to people all over the country that it was not the case, that the EU, in fact, was not an enemy. Now, under the Biden administration, there's a very, very different approach, a very different rhetoric of trying to approach the global challenges, whether it is climate, or whether it is new technologies, or whether it is indeed countries like China or Russia together. It is the only way we can actually do it effectively, Americans and Europeans together. And so my job has changed from playing defense, if you like, to playing offense, to trying to put on the table concrete proposals for cooperation between Americans and Europeans on every one of these fields. And these fields fundamentally were defined as under four big umbrellas back in June, when President Biden was in Europe, and we had the first in years EU-US summit between our leaders, President von der Leyen of the European Commission, President Michel of the European Council, the federal government, the member states, and President Biden. And we focused on post-COVID recovery and economic recovery. That's one pillar. We focused on trade and investment. That is a second pillar. We focused on climate and energy, a third pillar, and we focused on democracy in the world, a fourth pillar. And let me very quickly unpack those for you before we go to the discussion, so you have a better sense of what we're talking about. So when it comes to COVID recovery, interestingly, under our federal system, a federated system in Europe, health was not one of these competences, as we call it, that have been given by member states to the European Commission. So it was a competence that was kept by every single of our 27 countries separately to decide on its own. But of course, COVID was a huge wake-up call there. And at the beginning, we realized that we couldn't possibly alone procure the equipment that we needed, protective and other equipment, each independently fighting with each other in the open market with huge scarcities out there to begin with. And that we also could not fulfill our obligation, an interest-based one, but a moral one as well, to develop vaccines, to support pharmaceuticals, both for ourselves and for the rest of the world, if we did it alone. And so we stopped doing it alone. We procured collectively all the PPE equipment we needed as 27 member states, as EU, and that gave us a tremendous negotiating power at the first months of the pandemic to get those equipments quickly in the EU at low prices. But we also invested massively together, member states and the European Union, in developing the vaccines and pharmaceuticals for the rest of the world. And I have to say, Aaron, I don't know how well known this is, but the Savior vaccine, the first vaccine that came out, was a celebration of European and American cooperation. It is the Pfizer Biointact vaccine, produced by Pfizer, an American company, headed, by the way, by Albert Bourla, a Greek citizen, a European, and Biointact, a German company, headed, by the way, by two Germans from Turkey initially. And that vaccine changed entirely the landscape when it comes to fighting COVID, in addition to the others that came afterwards as well. So let's keep this in mind. Now, when it comes to our ability to come out of COVID, let me also say that we have focused from the first day to the rest of the world. And this is not simply a sort of a values instinct, but also an interest instinct. There is no question that COVID has been used by countries that are authoritarian in nature to spread a narrative that somehow authoritarians do a better job protecting people in their countries and around the world than democracies do. In fact, it is democracies who have always been the biggest, fairest distributors of global public goods to the world. And we missed, to be honest, between ourselves, we missed an opportunity to send that message across real fast from the beginning. But we in Europe did so as much as we could. We did not restrict the export of vaccines to other countries, vaccines produced in the European Union. And so we allowed hundreds of countries around the world to receive vaccines. And then we committed our own vaccines, those that we have bought ourselves for our people, for distribution to countries, especially poorer countries around the world. We also put together a mechanism, we call it Team Europe. So it's all our member states pulling their power together with the European Union to support the health systems in poor countries around the world, to support the World Health Organization. So, like I said, these are not Mother Teresa things to do. These are fundamental. And finally, when it comes to economic recovery from COVID, boy, we certainly do not leave any crisis in Europe, to go to waste, as it were. And we ensure that for the first time in our history, we borrowed together in the open markets more than $1 trillion to be able to support our member states, especially those who were most hit by COVID, to recover. That is important for the US as well, because the single market that the EU has is the fundamental reason why American companies make more profits in Europe than anywhere else in the world, being able to invest in any corner of Europe, and then to be able to go anywhere else in Europe without any barriers. And the strength that this market has given to our companies in Europe is the single reason why our companies, European companies, are the single biggest investor in companies' innovation and growth in the United States from outside from the US by far. About 60% of all foreign investment in this country comes from European companies. And that is something that creates jobs, brings food to the table for about 8 million Americans, and an equivalent number of jobs and food to the table come to the EU from US trade and US investment in the EU. And that brings me to the second big element of our four-pronged work together with the US, which is trade indeed. Please keep in mind, 42% of global GDP is US and EU together. That is huge. And about a third, more than a third of global trade and investment is EU and US trade and investment. We're the biggest artery for the world economy today. And we are the biggest supporter of prosperity in our own societies, aside from what we do ourselves for our own economies. And this is something that also translates into Missouri itself. So if you look at the state, I am proud that about $4.5 billion worth of goods get exported to the EU every year. I am proud that over $33 billion of investment come to Missouri from European companies. And I am proud that about 65,000 jobs today in Missouri are created by that trade relationship and by that investment relationship. So it all translates to local. And of course, everything is local. We know this in the States, in Europe as well, and that's important. When it comes to trade, also with the new administration, we moved very quickly to ground a number of trade disputes, because you realize when the biggest economic artery in the world is marred by unnecessary trade disputes, that is a threat of a heart attack, not just for both our economies, but also for the world economy. And so we had disputes such as the Airbus Boeing dispute. This may be esoteric stuff. I can talk more about it if any one of you is interested. That were out there for 15 years, where the US, under the previous administration, had decided to impose tariffs on the EU, where the EU was forced to retaliate with tariffs on the US. And at the end of the day, we said, okay, enough is enough. We're coming out of recovery of COVID. We got to recover. We cannot have tariffs on each other. And the same thing goes for another big dispute that started again about 3 years ago on steel aluminum, where European steel was termed by the previous administration as a national security threat. Of course, it never was. The real issue with steel aluminum around the world is Chinese overcapacity that is threatening the EU steel producers as much as it threatens the American steel producers. Again, then there were tariffs imposed by the US, there were counter tariffs imposed by the EU, and we grounded that dispute as well. So now we're looking to the future when it comes to trade. How do you take that 42% of the world's GDP and translate it into a positive agenda? And there, what I'd like to say, Aaron, is first of all, we launched a Trade and Technology Council in Pittsburgh a couple of months ago. Americans and Europeans now at the highest level are looking at how to formulate the rules for the 21st century economy so that they respect a level playing field, they fight unfair trade practices by China and others, and they ensure that our values are baked in the new technologies that are coming out and that will rule our future for decades to come. And also, just today, the EU announced a new strategy to invest around the world, to connect with our partners around the world following COVID. Close to $350 billion will be invested in the next few years by the EU and its member states. We will bid for those contracts for hospitals and for schools. We will encourage investments in green energy and transport. We will encourage investments in research and development in all our partner countries around the world in a way that is fair, in a way that doesn't tie knots around the necks, whether it is debt knots or stuff like that. We will make a difference to the world. Fundamentally, if you want a soundbite for this, I would say that our new strategy that we're coordinating very closely with the US as well, which will be coming out with its own so-called connectivity strategy very soon, is based on the concept that we will not be making offers to countries that they cannot refuse. We'll be making offers to countries that they will want to accept, because they will not be dirty offers. They will not be corrupt offers. They will be transparent offers. They will be values-based. They will ensure that workers, students, others in those countries benefit directly from those investments. And that is something that we are committed to. Now, very quickly, because I've taken too much time in the introduction, when it comes to climate, guys, this is the existential threat of the 21st century. It's not a hoax. It's happening as we speak. We see it with the deadly fires and floods in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere. And Americans and Europeans have started working very close together in the world stage to make sure that we stop this from happening. Because, quite frankly, the planet, yes, we're doing it for the planet, but the planet, lived for billions of years without humans, and it most likely will exist for billions of years without humans again. So I'm not doing it for the planet. We're doing it to ensure that we survive on the planet. And the way that, unless we manage to keep that the heat coming up, unless we're under control, the costs and the catastrophes to our way of life, to our lives themselves, and to our livelihoods will be exponentially more expensive than what we're seeing now, with the need to mitigate and the need to transition. The transition is going to take time. And so in Europe, we are focusing also on what we call just transition. Now, what I mean by this, Aaron, this is very important. We have seen in the past, including through globalization, that allowing the markets alone to always make decisions of what happens to those who lose their jobs because more efficient products come from the outside or all that stuff doesn't work. Many people end up just losing the jobs and the livelihoods, and they get marginalized in societies that become increasingly unequal in the distribution of wealth. And that is the recipe for social explosion, in addition to, frankly, entirely unfair. So people will lose the jobs as we transition in climate. Our coal miners in Europe will lose their jobs. Your coal miners will lose their jobs. They're already losing them, frankly, because other technologies, including green technologies today, have reached economies of scale that are much cheaper than coal. But to say, well, the market will take care of these people is not going to work. So we have established a multi-billion euro fund to ensure that we support actively and concretely those communities today, so that they don't end up just getting handouts, but that they can preserve their way of life and change, transition to new jobs that they're entirely possible. They're not always easy. It's not an easy process, but they're entirely possible, and this is what we're going to be doing. And finally, let me just close with democracy. So we are in a values battle around the world. There's no question about that. And to tie it in with trade as well, because we're in a trade battle as well, unfair trade practices, including things like the Belt and Road Initiative from China, that our global gateway initiative that I mentioned before, connectivity, obviously will provide an alternative to. But when you look at our trade, what people, in our containers we put our goods, right, and then we ship them somewhere. And what many people don't see that in those containers, because actually that is not something you can see, it's not visible. Every time we put a good, we also put in those containers our values. When I produce something that I export anywhere in the world, in Europe, I do it through protecting labor rights. We do not use slave labor. We do not use forced labor. We do not use child labor. I do it by protecting the environment. We do not produce cheap goods, fast goods by polluting our rivers and our seas and our land. Those values are in those containers, and increasingly other countries are putting their own values in their own containers. So this is a really important battle. And the only thing I want to say here before we go to more things is we need to get Americans and Europeans in that values battle, in that democracy battle. We need to get allies. And in my view, we always make the mistake of simply focusing on those that we know are ideologically committed against democracy and human rights. We know who they are. And then we focus to build alliances only with those that we know that they are ideologically or politically committed for democracy and human rights. We know who they are. But we very often ignore the more than 100 countries around there in the world that are sitting on the fence. They're not exactly not democratic. In fact, they have some good rules, some good laws, perhaps in some things, in others they don't. They are developing the democracies. And if we are to ask them simply pick sides, they will just listen to the most attractive and quick siren, or the one that is closest geographic proximity to them. Now, in order to create that diplomatic firepower and the strategy, the geostrategy to be able to bring those countries to the right side of that fence, we need a tremendous amount of work together. And it's not easy work. Nothing is easy, but it's entirely doable. We have to give ownership of democracy and human rights to those countries, even if they're not perfect. And we have to keep them with us in our joint effort to become perfect, because we are not perfect ourselves. I don't mean to paint a fantastic picture for the European Union. We have challenges today. You may have heard that there are legal proceedings in motion against a couple of our own member states for what the European Commission and the European Parliament have deemed to be violations of fundamental rights in their political systems. So this is, democracy is the toughest political system in the world. It requires, for it to work, informed citizens that can talk to each other, that can discuss with each other, that can disagree, but in a way that does not fundamentally undermine the general feeling that they have that they belong in a safe space of a democracy that allows them to work together. Democracy requires us to be able to have that discussion, every citizen, and also to believe that the person who will win an election will not win it just for their people, taking care only of their people and excluding everyone else from the equation, because if that's your feeling, then you absolutely never want to lose an election. And when you get to that, you will do everything possible not to. And if you get to that, then you are very close to some other political systems around the world that we are, as I said, ideologically and politically committed against. So the biggest issue that I see that we have to also deal with in our democracies is the hatred, is the belief that we simply cannot talk to each other. We have to get back to the fundamentals because the issues out there are complex, and when the issues are complex and difficult, from COVID to climate to anything else, an informed citizenry is difficult to have. And the dictator easily comes in and says, you know what, don't bother with all this stuff, all this debate. I'll take care of you. I'll get it done for you. So it is precisely when we're facing crises and difficulties that we owe it to ourselves and our democracies to find a way to talk to each other. And if we achieve that, I have no fears for the future. So Aaron, thank you so much. Spoke more than I wanted to, but I wanted to give you as big of an overview as I could of what the EU today is, how it works, and what our joint work with the US is. And I'm more than happy to get your questions and the audience questions. But again, such a pleasure and a privilege to be here with you today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much. I appreciate that. And and unfortunately, I am going to ask you to speak some more. We have a host of questions, and it's interesting. Something that really stuck out to me was the idea of democracy requiring informed citizens, and that to me is essentially what we're all doing here today. We have an opportunity to have a discussion with you, to learn from your experiences, to get some insights from you. So along those lines, I want to make this as meaningful as possible for the people that are here today. Please feel free to use the chat function to put in whatever questions you may have for the ambassador. But I have one that I'd like to ask, just to kind of get things started. You mentioned China a couple times, both with regard to trade and democracy, and so I guess just kind of broadly speaking, what does the EU's relationship with China look like right now, and where do you see that going in the future?
So from 2019, we have a joint what we call the joint communication, because we're Europeans and we want to call things in names that are so boring that no one is interested to read them other than us, I suppose. It's a joint communication, but it is, we have a joint EU member state, all the member states, unanimous decision on a strategy towards China. And it identifies China as three things. One, a necessary cooperation partner when it comes to major challenges in the world, including non-proliferation or climate change, where we have to work together, because if we don't, then those issues would not be resolved. And I put COVID in those issues as well. We term China as a competitor, and often an unfair competitor when it comes to especially the economy, trade, investment. And we also term China a systemic rival to the European Union when it comes to issues of governance and human rights, for example. So it is a multifaceted approach, and it has to be. It cannot be otherwise. China is a huge country. We may wish to wish it away, but that's not going to happen. And so we have to find ways, Americans and Europeans, to be able to contain China and to stop it when it tries in trade or investment to gain unfair advantage. We certainly have to, as I mentioned before, create alliances to ensure that we stop the export of non-democratic values around the world. But we also have to work with China on different challenges. Now, fundamentally, Aaron, the way that we are approaching China is in a with a very simple construct, which is that we can sit back and just simply complain about everything that China is doing and try to change it, which is not easy internally for the reasons that we know. Although try to change it, we will. But fundamentally, what we are doing is ensuring that we can run faster than China. And that is a very different way to approach this issue than to say we have to stop China. Running faster than China focuses on what you need to do, what maybe you haven't done the past few years you should have done, in order to ensure that when it comes to innovation, for example, in the new technologies, where Europe and the United States have always been by far in the forefront, we reinvest in our economies, in our companies, in our universities, in our innovative minds, to win this race of the 21st century. This is something that we have to do. I don't particularly care what China does in this. I care what I do in this. So when Americans and Europeans, for example, are looking now together at issues such as supply chains, in addition to everything else, making sure that we keep open trade around the world, which is a prerequisite for our economic prosperity. This is what has made the US and the EU so economically powerful in the past decades, right? But at the same time, we also examine what are our joint vulnerabilities when it comes to supply chains. Can we afford not to be producing enough medicine in our own economies, for example? Can we find a way to look at the EU and the US more strategically as what they really are, which is that they are, of course, we're competitors when it comes to the economy, but we have a huge stake in each other's success. So we are, in a sense, a single market when it comes to producing high-valued goods with open innovation and open competition. When we look at those things, we realize that we can have an economy coming out of COVID that can make us both extremely strong and then can make us both capable to be out there in the world, also investing fairly as opposed to unfairly, non-corruptly as opposed to corruptly in many countries in the world. And so making sure we run faster than China is key. And then the second prong of that analysis is we have to protect the runners. So if you're going to be investing massively and your innovators are coming up with the technology of the 21st century, well, you certainly cannot afford having anyone stealing their innovations or the IP rights. You certainly cannot have situations where companies are being forced into joint ventures in order to invest in a country like China, losing power over their technology or over their investment. You also have to look at things like protecting your market from unfair practices. And this is where, if I may, I will throw this out. We have to look at things like a carbon border adjustment mechanism when it comes to transitioning to clean. Guys, this is what this means very simply. We will have to transition our companies to clean. In Europe, we're already doing it. And our economy has skyrocketed to 65% GDP growth since 1990, 65% GDP growth, while we have reduced our carbon emissions by more than 25%. Now that tells you something. These two things are contradictory, but you cannot be making that effort, which costs a lot of money. And at the same time, have other countries produce dirty, cheap goods, not caring about the environment, and then importing all their carbon emissions into your own borders by importing those goods without a cost into your own borders. You can't do that. So you have to, first of all, put a price on carbon, as we have in the European Union. And then you have to make sure that everyone else around the world pays that price as well, either because they will, which is our hope, impose their own costs on their own economies to make that transition, or because they don't, in which case they have to make sure that their dirty goods are much more expensive. So it is things like that we're discussing together, Americans and Europeans today. And when you look at China and the China challenge, it is complicated, as I said. It is multifaceted. It's not one size fits all approach. But in the end of the day, running faster and protecting the runners, I am absolutely convinced is going to make us, again, the obvious overpowering economic and values distributors in the world in the next century.
I appreciate that very much. Thank you. I want to pivot a little bit and talk about, I suppose, what I would almost call an EU domestic situation, which is Brexit. And, it's something that's very near and dear to my heart. I lived and worked in London for 4 years when it was still part of the EU. And so keeping up on, the evolving relations between the United Kingdom and the EU, it's an interesting and important situation. So I was curious from your standpoint, where does that process stand? How is that viewed from within the EU to unfortunately lose a member state?
Yeah, well, look, we didn't want to lose a member state. We wanted the UK to stay in. The UK was a member for 40 years with many privileges as a member. It was a decision of the British people who voted in a referendum, non-binding referendum, and frankly, therefore, it was a decision of British governments to interpret that referendum that was won by the Brexiteers by a very small percentage as a mandatory process outside of the EU. Now, that's the first point. The second point is that this process created, and we all saw this, those interested glued in the TV screens, created much more division and split and angst in the UK itself than it did in the European Union. We weren't happy for the UK to leave, but if they wanted to leave, okay. We were prepared to just develop the most open trade relationship that we've had with any third country outside of the EU, because of course, you cannot defy gravity. The UK is there and we wanted to be there, it's Europe. And we're prepared to develop the most detailed security and other relations. But we also were prepared and committed to ensure that the Good Friday Agreement and the peace in Ireland would be preserved. And that is important to understand because, in fact, today, with the UK leaving, the only actual border that the UK has with the EU is through Northern Ireland, coming to Ireland. And the Good Friday Agreement destroyed that border. So we had to circle the square in a sense. And that was something we had to do, not because we wanted to, but because the UK decided they wanted to leave the EU. Circling the square means that we had to make sure that now the goods and the services, but mostly the goods coming in the EU, especially if the UK decided to diverge from all those common market rules that I mentioned before, that we all accept and have put together with great cost to our different member states, but that is the single market. To preserve the strength of the European single market and the integrity, we have to be able to check those goods in the same way that the US checks goods coming from other countries to ensure that they comply with American sanitary, phytosanitary standards, let's say, health standards for food products, animal products, and safety standards for everything else. So we came to a situation where we had to find a way to control that, and that was the withdrawal agreement, which in a sense the divorce agreement with the UK, and what we call the Northern Ireland Protocol, which established exactly how those UK goods would be able to be checked by UK customs officials before they came into the EU through Northern Ireland, right? Northern Ireland itself had the best of both worlds in that agreement, in that it is a full member of the UK market, but also a member of the EU single market. And that was the compromise that was found in order to be able to ensure that those goods could, with the fewest possible checks, come in. So the UK, through successive governments, signed on to that agreement. It was an agreement they negotiated. In fact, they didn't like a first one. They negotiated with Boris Johnson a second one. And now they are coming out and they're saying, we don't like it, we want to violate it. Well, it can happen. The UK has to enforce the agreements that it signs if it is going to be around the world, a responsible major country that it is. And we have shown every flexibility on the part of the EU to ensure that the difficulties, because there are difficulties in practice in applying all those rules in this complex situation, can be alleviated. And we've made those proposals. But in the UK, the government appears to me, at least, to feel that it is beneficial to it to keep talking against the EU as if Brexit hasn't happened yet, whereas it has, instead of focusing how it is that we can actually make this relationship work. And we want it to work. So I am hopeful and confident that reason will prevail, and that law will prevail. And please be assured, yourself, Aaron, and those who are listening to us who have an interest in this, that the European Union is going to do everything possible, and it is doing everything possible, to ensure that that this new arrangement can work to certainly the benefit of the European Union itself, but also the benefit of the UK.
Well, thank you. I wonder if we could shift from the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland to the border between Poland and Belarus, and talk a little bit about the refugee crisis that's ongoing there, and how the EU is working to address the situation there.
So Lukashenko has used people as weapons, hoping to undermine the European Union's unity by sending them, by inviting them to his country through massive flights from different countries around the world, and then by pushing them, sometimes forcefully, to the borders with Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, trying to push them through and create a fake migration crisis. And this hybrid attack against the EU has not worked for Mr. Lukashenko. In fact, the EU has not been divided by this. We have been even more united than before. And today we announced the proposals for some new measures, temporary measures, to ensure that those people who are being, weaponized by Lukashenko, nevertheless, do not suffer the consequence of his cruelty, and to allow for our member states fully respecting EU commitments and obligations under international law for protecting people who truly require refuge, to be able to examine those applications and do so, but also to be able to send back quickly people who are not deemed, as legitimate refugees back to their countries of origin, while of course respecting the international rule of non-refoulement, which means you don't send people back where there's a danger they may actually be killed or harmed when they go back. So this is very important to stop at its tracks, because it is this insidious and this supremely dangerous convergence of human trafficking networks, who are even most profitable today around the world than drug trafficking networks, with authoritarian leaders trying to violate, the stability of democracies. And this model cannot win, because if it does, then you can see it taking place in other countries, including potentially in the US or around the US's borders. So this has to be stopped in its tracks, but it has to be done in a way that legitimate refugees do have their rights examined fully, as is our obligation under international law, and that is what we're doing. We have also unleashed a diplomatic offensive around the world, including in countries from which all these planes carrying those desperate people to Belarus were coming from, to stop those flights. And we have announced we're going to be imposing sanctions on any airline that is facilitating human trafficking of that scale through Belarus. And I'm glad to say that many airlines already announced, before sanctions are even in place, that they will be stopping those flights. So that is, in a nutshell, my answer to Lukashenko and Belarus. The migration refugee issue is a much bigger one that both we in Europe and you in the United States have to deal with. And that's a different discussion if you want to have it. But for Lukashenko, I think that's enough.
I appreciate that very much. And throughout this conversation, we've talked about economic power. You've talked about exporting values, things like that. One thing we've not talked very much about, and one of the questions that's been asked, is whether or not the EU has plans for developing sort of I suppose, an EU-wide military capacity. And the question specifically says there were discussions of an EU rapid deployment capacity, and they were curious as to what the prospects are for that actually being developed.
Well, this is being discussed as we speak. So yes, the answer is we are planning to become much more capable when it comes to a joint collective defense as Europeans, and that is necessary. The U.S. cannot be the army for all the world all the time, and we also understand that from successive U.S. administrations that there is a desire for the U.S. to be able to focus more on particular areas and to withdraw from others. And we have to take care of ourselves, our defense, our security, and our neighborhood. That does not mean creating a European army. We're not there. And in fact, NATO is in the European treaties itself explicitly and repeatedly described as the security umbrella for the EU. And many European member states, the vast majority are members of NATO, but of course not all. And then NATO also has other countries in it that are not European member states. So we sat down together and we said, okay, we have to become much more capable in developing and producing capabilities, military capabilities together. We have to be much more capable in deploying together. And that comes to your question of that rapid response force. And we have to be much more capable in funding together. You know, what many people don't know is that the European Union countries today are the second biggest spenders on defense after the United States in the world. The problem is that we each spend separately. A result of that, for example, is that you have 17 different tanks in Europe. Now, that can't work. That is spending a lot of money very inefficiently. You have to be able to develop one or two tanks, which are the absolutely best tanks, using the best expertise and technology that we have in your extremely advanced technologically European Union member states, and be able to have them there to defend. And I'm very, very pleased that the US administration has recognized repeatedly with statements recently, the importance of the US becoming much more, united and advanced in its capabilities development. And the reason the US supports this is also because, Aaron, we do not have a separate Greek army for Greece and a separate Greek army for NATO. It's the same army. We don't have a separate German army for Germany, German army for NATO, same army. And so if we manage to get our armies in our member states stronger, more capable, more organized, that means automatically that NATO is going to be stronger and more capable. And this is precisely what we are trying to do. Now, we are looking at what we call a strategic compass for Europe. Our member states are discussing this as we speak, which is an effort to identify both collectively as Europeans what the main defense and security challenges around the world will be in the next years, and also to identify what we need to do together to address them more effectively. One of the proposals, but there are many proposals in that paper, is to develop a rapid force in the EU context that will be able to, for example, in cases such as Afghanistan, when suddenly we had to evacuate tens of thousands of people, but we didn't as Europeans have the capability to do so, to maybe in the future be able to have the force, the capacity to do so ourselves, if need be. So these are the kinds of discussions that are happening now. But a stronger Europe defensively means a stronger NATO defensively, means a stronger United States defensively. And this is precisely what we're trying to achieve.
I appreciate that very much. One part of the world that we've not talked about very much, and we're getting towards the end here, so this may end up being potentially the last question, which is, what does the EU's relationship right now with Iran look like? And how do you see that evolving?
Well, our relationship with Iran the past few years has basically focused on the Iran nuclear deal. We brokered it with the United States and Iran, Russia, China, Germany, France, the UK. We brokered it, and then we were very frustrated that although it was repeatedly examined to be applied and respected by Iran, reducing dramatically its capacity to quickly develop a nuclear weapon, a few years back, the US moved out of that deal and imposed sanctions. We warned at the time that this would not contain Iran, but most likely would allow the most hardline elements in the system to try to develop even more nuclear capabilities. And this is precisely what has happened, in addition to Iran becoming more destabilizing in its region. So now the EU is again mediating in negotiations for a full return to the Iran deal, fundamentally by Iran, but also by the United States and everyone else, in Vienna. And there was a new round of talks that just began in Vienna after the Iranians had elections and they had a more hardline government that was established there. So this is our focus. Iran has to not develop a nuclear weapon, and it has to not have the capacity to do it. We had an agreement that ensured that. We want to go back to that agreement, full compliance by everyone. That included also relieving Iran from some of the sanctions that were in place against it, precisely because it had not agreed to rein in its nuclear program, which we succeeded in getting it to rein in. So that is our focus with Iran now. More broadly, we are focusing in the whole region where Iran is in, a very disturbing region, a very unstable region. And we want to make sure that Iran and others in the region do not take actions that destabilize it further. And instead, we want to focus on ways that, in fact, there may be synergies and win-wins. Now, I know that's not easy, certainly not in the Middle East and the Gulf, but we will not stop trying because we believe those synergies do exist.
Appreciate that. Thank you very much. We have just a couple of minutes left, and I'm gonna ask a question of my own here. Something that I came across when preparing for this. I noticed that, as I'm sure you know, Oklahoma had recently scheduled an execution for a prisoner named Julius Jones, and it looked like you were quite vocal in your opposition to that execution, and I believe wrote a letter to the governor of Oklahoma, and ultimately that execution was canceled. Is that an area of personal focus for you? Is that an area of interest for the EU in terms of relations between the EU and the US? We're kind of curious as to the motivation for that.
Yeah, thanks for asking. It's an area of EU focus, which is why my letter was followed by the letters of a number of other European Union country ambassadors to the governor. And I was very pleased that the governor eventually commuted the sentence in accordance to what the board, the parole board in Oklahoma had recommended. This was one of the many, unfortunately, many cases in which there is very substantial doubt about the fairness of the system at the time that it made decisions against people on death row. And in the US in particular, more than 190 people in the past couple of decades who have been convicted by juries to death have been found through subsequent DNA evidence and other evidence to have been innocent and have been exonerated. And then you can imagine how many were not in time found to have been innocent and have been executed. We believe this is a major human rights issue, especially for democracies, because in our democracies, we are not simply committed to ensuring, and we are, that violent criminals get punished effectively. But we're also committed in democracies, not in authoritarian systems, that the innocent people do not get punished. And the problem with the death penalty is that it's an irreversible punishment. If you make a mistake, and every legal system, including the most advanced ones, such as in the US, make mistakes. We've seen this. You cannot take it back. Now, in Europe, a condition to joining the European Union is that you outlaw the death penalty. Precisely for those reasons I described. They are deeply humanitarian, human rights reasons. By this, I do not mean for a second to imply that I feel any particular or any at all sympathy for violent criminals and killers. No one does. The question is, how can you actually ensure that you punish those people effectively, and you can through very long sentences, including life sentences, without allowing those killers to turn you, a Democrat, into an executioner. And in Europe, we have low crime rates, even though we don't apply the death penalty. So it is a very, very big issue that we're discussing. Now, there are many other issues around the death penalty. The fact that if you look at the actual statistics, you see that it usually gets applied almost overwhelmingly against marginalized communities in the United States. And this is also the reason why the majority now of US states, do not apply the death penalty, either in law, they have outlawed it, or in practice through moratoria they've put in place. Many people don't know this. So the majority of US states, and a huge number, a very large number in the past 10 years or so, have joined this world movement to stop death penalty while ensuring that you can punish effectively the most serious criminals, and therefore to truly deter serious crimes from happening in the future. So yes, it is a topic of EU interest, and we hope to be able to garner support on this, because it's not just, as I said, the right thing to do for our democracies, for our own democracies. It's also a signal that we have to give to the rest of the world. Democracies are different than others. The biggest executioners today around the world are China and Iran. Do you know this? China and Iran are by far the biggest executioners, and they do it without any transparency. At least in our systems, we're transparent. I mean, in your system, there's transparency. You know who was convicted, how, with what process, even though, very serious mistakes are very often made. It's in Belarus, by the way, the only country in Europe that still has the best death penalty. So my hope is that the United States as a whole, both at the federal level and at the state level, will join all us in the European Union and many other countries around the world in saying no. We stand by the victims and their families 100%. We always will. But we do not believe the death penalty is an effective way to prevent those crimes. We have better ways to do it with serious penalties, and we'll do it. That's where we stand on this.
Well, thank you so much. And I recognize now that I have taken up more than the hour of your time. Well,
I hope. Do you see? I don't see who is on the call. Do you have more people now than you had at the beginning, or do you have much fewer?
we failed here, Aaron. I think the only ones we lost are the people that I asked and begged and pleaded to be here. No, we have a number of people who are still very much engaged, very appreciative of your time, and I really do appreciate you making the opportunity. And for everyone who is with us, thank you for joining us for this discussion. Again, Ambassador Lambrinidis, thank you for taking the time. We hope that we have the opportunity to have you come visit us in person in Kansas City when it's prudent to do so. But in the meantime, for everyone else, please take a look at the IRC's website, look at our upcoming programs, and thank you again for your excellent questions. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to get to all of them, but Mr. Ambassador, thank you again. Thank you for making the time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Have a wonderful day.
Thanks.